I want to ask you about the start of MAG and how we got to where we are today. As someone who is a very high A driven individual, what is the exacts that are kind of going through your head during that 48-hour period? Is it something you had thought of before then that you just kind of enacted on, or was it really just a spur of the moment?
So when I was working at Lights Online, which is owned by Progressive Lighting here in Georgia, it was a boring job. I was like not pushed at all. And I was waiting for the company to catch up to like the 17 ideas that I pitched. I had taken on some side hustle consulting just so that my skills were sharper. So during the year and a half I was working at the lighting company, I had taken on like 12 different side hustle consulting projects. When I got laid off, there was no thought of vacation. I was so bored already. I was like ready to start working. I like went home and I like fixed my resume. I'm just going to go right into it. And there's a lot of people listening to this that resonates with because some of them just immediately get to work. But during that process, I knew that I needed to have some thinking time. I didn't put a lot of thinking time in. It was a heavy amount during that like couple of hours that I gave it though. I had a deck that goes out to the forest, looking outside of the forest. And the thought that I had really a hard time grappling with was, had I peaked? Age 30 years old, making $200,000, had I peaked? And of course, I came to the conclusion that no, I hadn't. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here today. But during that couple of hours, I seriously questioned my self esteem, my self worth, my abilities. And I was like, who's going to hire this 30-year-old guy at $200,000? And then I realized it wasn't that hard to answer because I would hire that guy. So I did. And I immediately went to LinkedIn and said, hey, I'm going to be doing some consulting and I'm going to be going full time on this until I figure out what I want to do with my life. I may or may not be doing it justice on the exact wording, but I really didn't actually think I was going to be doing this full time. Like I thought, oh, I'm just going to do this until I find my next gig. And so it took me months to burn my ships. I was like, I do not want to start an agency. I've worked at an agency before. I know how hard it is. You're shoveling manure all day long and Amazon's got a problem. It's your fault as the agency. And if the client wants you to grow sales 3% faster, it's your fault as the agency, even though their prices are 50% over the next competitors or their reviews are at a 3.3. Things you don't have control over, also your fault as the agency. And I, as a super introvert, did not want to deal with people. You know, like I would rather just send my wine glasses off to Amazon and let Amazon handle with the customer service and the returns, and you didn't send me the right product. And, you know, I didn't want to deal with any of that. I really didn't. But what happened was not necessarily what I expected. I get into that first account and I was working on a supplement brand, not the best first agency brand, first of all.
You mean the exact thing I tell people not to do?
Yeah, yes, yes. The product category to avoid as a first time seller. To be fair, at this point, I was an Amazon expert. I knew what I was doing. I knew exactly how to help them. I had helped, I don't know, 30 brands at this point, right? So a lot of times when some people like think, oh, I'm going to go start an agency, they've only worked on like one or two accounts. The 30 accounts in, I took on the hardest deal. And that's probably why they signed in under 48 hours. They were desperate. They had gone through 3 other consultants before me. Nobody had been able to get them past $4,000 a month in sales. Now, I'm a marketer. I'm a high drive marketer. I can problem solve anything. I'm technical. I type 123 words per minute. I'm saying all this not to brag, but just to like paint the picture of who I am. What I'm not good at is design. And so as I started to load these products, I realized, frick, they need a brand store. I don't know any designers. So I threw one together myself. I just like piecemealed it. And then I shot a YouTube video about how I did it. It was like one of my first videos on my channel and it got 250,000 hits. And it was like a guy who's not a designer. I don't even know if Canva existed at this point, 6.5 years ago. No design skills, put together a brand store. And it worked. By the way, this brand was so complicated. They had 5 brands. 5 supplement brands, and they're in Walgreens and Walmart. So the omni-channel, their UPCs were hijacked by the Chinese. So when I'm going to load the product and like tutus were loading up on the screen or some tweezers, and I'm like, this is a supplement. What's going on? And me trying to go back to the brand owner and explain this is like, we're going to go buy some UPCs on eBay and reload these. All right. And they're like, no, we can't do that. I'm like, you don't have a choice. Like all of your UPCs are burnt. And so I had to deal with that. But within the first couple of months, by the end of day 90, I had them to $83,000 in monthly sales. And they thought I was a genius. They thought I was brilliant. And they're like, geez, Luis, Steven, how did you pull this off? And within that first couple of months, I also started making more YouTube videos, more contents, more LinkedIn posts. And I got picked up by 14 different brands in the first 90 days. And I was making $43,000 in MRR, monthly recurring revenue, by the end of day 90. So everything just magically fell into place. So I had to hire really fast. I had to put an employee into my home. So we converted our guest bedroom into a makeshift office. I started calling people at my church. I'm like, do you know anybody? And I was serving in what's called the Elders Quorum presidency of my church. And he's like, yeah, my daughter, she's looking for a summer job. I'll take her. Call her up, start tomorrow. I need anybody. Do you know how to use Excel? Great, show up at my house. And boom, we're after the races. Day one, I'm like, Excel file, figure out how to modify this data and put it into the spreadsheet, watch this video, and 8 hours of just merchandise this Excel file. That was day one for it. And she came back day two. She was a fantastic hire.
That's a trooper right there.
Yeah, totally worked out. Magical first hire. Second hire went the same way. And like clients liked them, which was even better. I was the acting brand manager. They were basically Amazon specialists behind the scenes, but I brought some of them to calls. I mean, I took every call while they were in the room together. So they got all of the real world training. That was the genesis. It was just, I got into an elevator and all of a sudden I was on floor 50 and I was like, what?
I think the most interesting part of that is you actively saying that you didn't even want to be a business owner or an agency owner.
I wanted the money, but I didn't want the problem. I'm like, I'm a businessman. I've seen so many businesses run and fail and all the I was so tired of internal politics. I was the hotshot guy that would show up to a business and figure out how to crack it in 10 days. And I'd go to the CEO and I'm like, this is exactly what we need to do. And I give him my plan.
With that regard, I guess, does that same kind of sentiment still carry over, 6 years later to current Mag Day runnings? Because I personally would say yes. I feel like a lot of those similar thoughts, similar teachings, you still kind of hold very much dear with, how we operated and gotten to where we are. We're very good at keeping, everyone on the same page, rowing the same way and not being divulging. But same time, yes, dealing with brands, you're still actively looking at, okay, let's just get a single brand. What do they need? Let's give it to them and ask them then, hey, did you get what you want?
That's the key, right? So the key to all of our business right now. Number one, ask the customer, what do you want? 2, give it to them. And 3, ask them, did you get what you wanted? Right? Like that's been the fundamental key to my success in growing my Amazon guide. Anybody listening to this, you can apply that to any business ever. That's been the real fundamental. But back to the politics for a brief moment. I learned from my corporate career. So I spent like 10 years in the corporate track, give or take. And some of that was Amazon focused, some of that wasn't. A couple of years was a TV reporter. 1 year I was redesigning the mobile app for Verizon Wireless as an agency. Crazy story. I don't talk a lot about it because I've got like some questionable NDAs, but I'm the guy that took it from 2.5 stars to 3.3 on the App Store. Still shitty, but like not as shitty. Long story short, I knew what politics looked like and I abhorred it. And I was like, I just want to get to work. I just want to drive results. I just want to get stuff done. Typically employers like that stuff. The problem is a lot of these organizations were flawed from the top down. They had weak leaders. They had people who didn't know how to build the right culture. And culture is top down. If you don't have the right culture in that top seat, everything underneath it will be corrupted or will be geriatric compared to that top down issue. So as I was going through these organizations, I realized that if I couldn't convince the top dog, nothing else would matter. And I saw that time and time again. So the more corporate environments that I was in, I would get stuck at these VP level challenges. And, I had bosses that I would give them the right answer, but they wouldn't pass it up the line. I would tell them exactly what needs to happen. I would show them the data. I'll give you one case example. I was at APMEX, American Precious Metals Exchange, $1 billion grossing company, but it runs like a $50 million company because it's got like a 3% margin because it's precious metals. They're the number one seller on eBay from a GMV standpoint in the entire world, which is kind of cool to think about. I was in charge of their acquisition. All acquisition went through me. And I was explaining to them like, hey, here's what we need to do. And I grew their SEO traffic by 10 million unique visitors, not visits, visitors, 10 million. And you can look it up on like SEMrush or whatever SEO tool you want. You can go check it out and you can see my hire data. It's so glorious. So I'd go into these boardroom meetings and I would show them the data and I'd be like, look, you build content and then you change a couple things on the site and then XYZ happens. And I would show them these charts where all of the organic traffic was spiking. And by the way, these were purchasing customers. There was revenue. I drove $60 million in revenue, year over year growth. Like without a doubt, I can prove it. And the Google Analytics backed it up. And the analytics department was like, yes, they had like a full-on analytics department, like 6 people deep. They all said, yes, he knows what he's talking about. And I'd go into these boardrooms and I'm like, cool, now that you guys bought into my process, here's what we need to do next. And they told me no. And I'm like, what do you mean no? And they're like, yeah, we're not going to do that. And I'm like, why? They're like, we don't necessarily believe it. I'm like, what do you mean you don't believe it? Look at the data. It's right here. So when I think about politics, I think about that moment more than any other moment because I couldn't persuade because of politics. I went in there 2 guns a-blazing, but rightfully so. It was a turnaround business. They needed me to come in there with guns a-blazing. They hired me knowing I was going to do guns a-blazing. And I went in with guns a-blazing. And then they're like, yeah, never mind. Whenever I think about politics, I think about how stupid that company was to let me go. And when I say let me go, I quit, right? Like I left. Because they wouldn't do what I said. Right? I wanted a company that would listen to me. And so Amazon, the nice thing about Amazon is I didn't have to deal with politics. And the nice thing about running your own company is that you can get rid of politics by just saying my way or the highway, I'll fire you or whatever. And I haven't had to do a lot of that, but I haven't had to do a lot of it because people are attracted to the no political environment. They're attracted to learning. If you want to learn more about Amazon, then this is the place. This is MAG. This is my Amazon guy. Number one reason somebody joins us is to learn. Number one reason somebody stays too is to learn. So if you want to learn, MAG is great. And the nice thing about learning is there doesn't have to be politics that interferes with learning. That's the kind of the history or the why behind the screw politics. And the closing thought I'll put on the political spectrum here is I have found that the less blurry lines are, the less politics there are. This is like the definition of your role and you fit into this box and you stay here. There's no politics because everybody's box is stacked together and you can make a pyramid, you can make a square, you can make whatever statute you want. But if you allow blurry lines and somebody starts like going out of their lines, that's when the politics start.
I think it's kind of interesting. And there was one aspect there that brought up another question in my head of specifically something we utilize pretty heavily here. We touched on it a little bit ago, but culture index. And you talked about the culture of the leader at the top. When was culture index introduced and what kind of effect do you think on the politics and on just the general internal scope of MAG has that?
So I onboarded culture index officially in June of 2021. So 3 years ago to basically the shooting of this conversation. Unofficially, I had started to look at culture index about 1.5 years prior to that. So I had my own culture index results from 1.5 years prior to that. And then I started to, get a couple of the culture index results of people around me. I had a socializer apply for my chief operating officer role. And the guy that gave me the survey result, he's like, don't make that higher. And I'm like, what do you mean? She's super nice. And he's like, exactly. You need somebody that's hostile. And I'm like, what do you mean? I need somebody hostile? And they're like, yeah, like if you put a nice person in charge of a bunch of people, what happens? And I'm like, I don't know, people like them. They can lead. And they're like, well, about that. Nice person can't hold other people accountable. And I'm like, whoa, tell me more about this. I started to learn about this. I realized that I needed to hire primarily high drive introverts who are impatient and detail oriented. And when you say it out loud like that, somebody who's never heard of culture index before, and they're like, what do you mean I need to hire high drive introverts who are impatient and detail oriented? This sounds ridiculous. And it does to the person who has no idea what we're talking about right now. But to the trained person, you can set up each role in a company based on parameters, based on a personality profile. And what we found is that certain roles do better with certain profiles, which makes sense. Just like the CIA would put together a personality profile of who would be a good field agent versus who would be somebody better pushing paper behind the desk. Those are two separate people, right? You probably need a charismatic person to sway the double agents over in China and Russia versus the person who's pushing paper. You just need somebody to follow direction. We figured the same thing out at my Amazon guy. And so what happened 3 years ago is I get the culture indexes of my leadership team, and I realized it wasn't the same leaders that I was going to need 3 years from now. But it took a long time to grapple with that. And I'm like, well, I'll just fix it by making new hires over time. I punted. I kicked the can down the curb. That's another challenge that leaders fall into. They know what needs to be done, but they delay decisions, and there's consequences to that. Just like you probably get 40 DMs a day on LinkedIn about sales pitches, right? No response is still a response in the sales funnel process. And no decision is still a decision in terms of the culture of a company. I came up very clearly. I knew exactly what I wanted to do 3 years ago, but it took years to implement it. A year in, I decided I was going to hire 100 interns because we couldn't hire enough people. It was like crazy. It was the number of deals we were closing in the hundreds, and we had like 100 people at MAG. So I go to the recruitment team on a Monday and I'm like, hey guys, I got an idea. We're going to hire 100 interns in 100 days. 24 hours go by. Tuesday rolls around. No hires. Guys, no, seriously, we're going to hire 100 interns right now. Wednesday rolls around. Nothing had been done as far as I could tell as the CEO. Like I had no updates, nothing. So I call the meeting. I'm like, guys, if offers don't go out by end, day-to-day heads are going to roll. I'm serious. We're hiring 100 interns. Go West. By that end of the day on Wednesday, 22 offers had gone out. And the rest is history. It didn't even take us 21 days to hire the 100 interns. And we hired primarily out of the Philippines. We went virtual. It was incredible. And that was the trajectory of becoming an embraced educational company with lots of people focused on the same things that we're focused on.
How much impact do you think the idea of implementing Culture Index has on where the company is now? Do you think we would even be close to where we are?
What happens in agencies is people tend to hire emotional extroverts. For whatever reason, emotional extroverts are attracted to agencies. I can't explain it. I don't understand it, but as a super logical introvert who emotions go away, right? Like I've noticed it. I've got the Culture Index data of the space. Like I've given it to a lot of our friendly competitors. And I can tell you right now that the average agency owner is a slightly high drive, super extrovert who's impatient and a big picture thinker, and generally emotional. What does an emotional extrovert tend to do? Hire other emotional extroverts. Why? Because there's passion. They want to be around passion, and they think clients also want to be around passion. And some clients do, let's be honest. Like otherwise this model would fail. But the problem with emotion and passion is that it has an unscalable factor to it. There is only so much passion you can fit into this bucket, and then it overfills and then they burn out. When I interview these other agencies, and a lot of them that have like sold their agencies, have moved on, they all burned out. All of them. They all eventually do. We're 6.5 years later, and I feel like I'm just getting started. And it's because I avoided the emotional burnout. Now, that doesn't mean we didn't have a few emotional people in the company. And there will be one person we won't name on this podcast that was a huge thorn on our side. And they were emotional and they were an extrovert. And I knew about that 3 years ago, but it made me so much money. I didn't want to part with it. Like they were such a great employee from a bottom line standpoint, but they were really hard to manage. I was so fed up and nobody wanted to manage them. And then they would sabotage other leaders that we tried to bring into the organization. And that's what happens with emotional divas. They take over, they become the center of attention, and they prevent growth. Knowing what we know with Culture Index, it's easier to identify that from a data standpoint, to predict human behavior, to understand how somebody will behave over time or in a particular viewpoint or setting. That's been the key, is to understand like how people act versus who they aren't necessarily like congruent. Those are separate things sometimes. Just because she's acting nice doesn't mean she is nice. Just because he is behaving a certain way doesn't mean that's who they are. And she's like, what do you mean? Don't you judge people based on their actions, not on what they say? And I'm like, yes, but just because they can do it doesn't mean they enjoy doing it. What's the consequences of doing something you don't enjoy for 90 days? You start to deteriorate. You start to, I don't know, your real personality seeps into it. What we did at My Amazon Guys, we profiled people just like the CIA did. And some people listening to this are think that's crazy. He's talking about the CIA profiling people. And I'm like, yeah, I am. I don't know how else to explain this, because it is unusual. But we profiled people to figure out, like, statistically speaking, the likelihood of people behaving a certain way and executing a certain behavior was actually calculatable. And at 540 employees today in 2024, I have enough data to validate the prediction. It was right. We are heading the right direction. We avoid the emotional extroverts. It makes the company easier to run, and it makes it more scalable.
At the end of the day, I think it helps us run better. I think it makes for a better overall environment for everyone, and I like it. But I guess one thing that's interesting, because you said company would not be where we are without Culture Index. On that idea, what is the biggest regret you have had while running MAG?
There were individuals at the company that fired me up, right? Like that made me get angry. And then I'd go out and like get passionate and get stuff done. And part of me was addicted to that. It wasn't a good fire up. Now that I've like axed that out of the system, it's much easier to run, and I still get fired up. But when you're living the moment, it's like being in an abusive relationship. You know, you're getting beaten by your partner, but you're like, but the sex is so good, right? Like that's what you're thinking. And that's kind of what it was like. And now that it's gone, I'm like, I could still have good things, right? Without that. And it's healthier.
I get where you're coming from, man. I get the idea of not doing something sooner. I feel like that's very common when it comes to, regrets, especially when it comes to like things that have done really, really well, right? Like, I mean, there's could even be the regret of like, hey, not starting the agency sooner, right? Like a lot of people would have.
I don't think I learned anything in the corporate world. A lot of people will be like, oh, you got to live in the corporate world before you run your own company. I don't think so. At least not for me. All that I accomplished is I went around in the corporate world and I made all these other dudes millions of dollars, and they made these awful mistakes, right? Like this one British company bought a $5 million warehouse in Baltimore, filled it to the brim of British goods, they didn't relabel the rubbish bins trash cans, and they started printing catalogs and expected everything to sell. And they also thought you could get to California in a couple hours from Baltimore. Not really, but kind of they did, because a classic European trope of Americanism where they think they can drive down from New York City to Miami and LA all in the same day or two. You can get to Paris from London in the same day, right? Like very easily. Go over to Prague the next day, whatever, no problem. But obviously the United States, very large company, geographical country. I'm here to say that I think almost every company is dysfunctional. And as a consultant or as an employee of these dysfunctional companies, I honestly don't know what a good company well run looks like. I structurally am blown away by how awful and how badly run most companies are. Like it typically, let's say it's a 50-person company. At every 50-person company, 5 people keep it together, less like 10%. I have found that to be true time and time again, that most companies are dysfunctional and they're barely running, they're barely making profits. Some are not even making profits. When I was on the corporate track, all I learned was dysfunction. If I had just started on my own earlier, forget college even, just like straight out of high school, I'm here to tell you, I probably would have a bigger company. I'd be richer, more wealthy because of it. Most people won't say that.
From the aspect you haven't seen anything really outside. I mean, I would say getting that perspective on the corporate world, having been in it, right, is probably the most value you've gotten out of it. I mean, not many people really are even willing to say that companies are ran poorly, and those that are usually don't have any idea how to actually fix the poorly ran company. So would that have given you at least like the bearing, if you hadn't done that, to know how to run this one?
I've established that most companies are run poorly. Let's establish this next. Let's say that I know how to fix every one of these companies. That doesn't mean I can, right? Like let that sit in for a second. Just because I know how to fix it doesn't mean I can fix it. So all of these backseat drivers, consultants who go around telling companies what to do, probably on more than a 55% chance, know actually how to fix these companies and are generally giving good advice. Otherwise, consultants wouldn't exist, right? But like, just because we know how to fix it doesn't mean we're capable of fixing it. Doesn't mean we can persuade the right stakeholders to make the right decisions. And that's what I learned was ultra frustrating going through all of these companies. Guys, I have the data. Go west. Here is how we're going to grow the company. Yeah, I'm good. No thanks. What do you mean no thanks? If we don't do this, you may not make payroll next month. Yeah, I know. I'd rather take the chances. It's too comfortable doing what we're currently doing. I don't want to make the change. And that's what we find time and time again running companies. So I've made the decision that I will always make the hard decision. I'm also criticizing myself in this conversation where I said I waited a couple of years to make the right decisions. Even the guy who knows how to fix it and might be capable of doing it on more than half a chance doesn't mean I actually do it. And that's what it's like to be a business owner, right? Like, you know what you have to do. You have a dragon to go slay, but you're like, man, the throne room is really comfortable. Let's talk about Game of Thrones for a second. I'm just going to go out in the wilderness and shoot a boar today, or a deer, or whatever. Now that boar may be the guy that does me in and, get a tusk in the side of the belly here. And then all of a sudden the whole Game of Thrones thing starts up. And instead, what I should have been doing is going up to that nice wall and making sure we got enough crows up there to keep track of the ice bin or whatever. But like, that's what it's like to be a business owner. You get comfortable. I've hit the I win button in life. I've made millions of dollars. I bought the dream house. I've got the family. I've got 5 kids, 8 and under. Got the nice car. I've got the, everything anybody ever could want. But it doesn't mean I will keep it if I don't continue making the right decisions, the tough decisions. So tough decisions are tough. They're hard. They're thick skin. It's like trying to pierce the dragon's hide with an arrow or a ballista. It's not easy to do it. You have to gear yourself up, right? This is why a lot of CEOs spend a lot of time working on themselves. Like if you look at the glow up of Jeff Bezos, for example, oh my goodness. He went from book nerd to like juggernaut, probably like vampiric, takes the blood of children and injects it. Like, you look at the dude. That was speculation. I think we actually do know he does those things. Let's be clear. But like, I find myself walking in the forest a lot. Why? Because it makes me face my demons. It makes me think about the big decision of the day. And I have to like ramp up. I got to gear up. I got to go to war, just like you do a war dance before you go into a war. That's what it takes to run a company and keep it going.
People are adverse to change, especially the more friction you add into that change. And that's something I've realized time and time again. And I think that kind of rings true when you're talking about knowing how to do it, not necessarily capable of doing it. But at the same time, I think you touching on from the aspect of most people are also adverse to even doing change for themselves. Even harder when I think, you're in a position such as you, or probably not as Jeff Bezos, I would imagine. But for the average person running a company, especially if you already have a dysfunctional company, imagine trying to take care of yourself while simultaneously taking care of a dysfunctional child that you have built with all these employees and everything. Even at that same standpoint, it would be difficult, I think, for anyone to say they don't want to change. And that's where, especially when we look at my Amazon guy, where we're currently at, what is the necessary change that you're looking at for whether it's now a year down the line or even further, or something that you're contemplating on that change?
Everybody thinks they want to change. Everybody says they want to change. But then when you actually put the decision in front of them and be like, today you need to do XYZ to make this change, crickets like start to enter the chat. Like, it's structurally speaking, nobody wants to do the uncomfortable. And so getting comfortable with the uncomfortable is like bar none the most important thing a leader can do. Just like I'll interview a leader and there's certain like positions in our company, like let's say executive. If somebody hasn't fired somebody before, I wouldn't hire them as an executive. And I had an interview with a potential executive and he had decades of experience, whatever. And I'd ask him, I'm like, so how many people have you fired? And he's like, none. I make them all work. And I'm like, what do you mean you make them all work? That's impossible, statistically impossible. And if you're not willing to, do the uncomfortable thing and get on a tough conversation and root out some evil, if you will, prune the garden, make it so that we've got some olive trees that are looking okay in the master of the garden, that's a challenge. That means you allowed some roots to go bad, to some trees to go wild. If we look at my Amazon guy, I think the most uncomfortable thing I'm going to have to overcome in the next year or two is how to acquire another company. I have nightmares about this because I firmly believe the only way I could acquire somebody else's company is to do a full hostile takeover. And I don't necessarily know how people are going to respond to that. I'm thinking like I go in and I'm like, okay, give me your clients, give me your people. And now everybody has to do it my way. And then we start giving out culture index and we realize that like half the people in the company aren't going to fit in the same way. And we're like, shit. What do we do? Right? Like that's what I'm worried about happening. And so what kind of company should I go acquire? Should I acquire more Amazon businesses? Well, I don't know. My acquisition costs are probably lower to acquire a client than to acquire a business in our space. If agencies in our space are going for an average of 8x, what does that look like? Versus me going out and just paying a lot of money to acquire a client. All right, that's tough to figure out. Should I go acquire a Google business so I can add another service to our space? Well, those are trading at more like 3.5x. That's a little easier to buy. There's a dime a dozen and they're all horses. There's no such thing as a unicorn Google PPC agency out there. Cool, makes sense. So then I think about, Facebook ads or TikTok or all of these other platforms and partners I could potentially go buy. Or maybe I pick up an Amazon Japanese business, try and get into the third largest marketplace in the world and start doing Japan. We looked at a Canadian French speaking agency. Maybe we can get into some, French speaking circuits. I don't speak French. That's terrifying, right? So there's a lot of things we've been floating around and ideas, but that business development of trying to go west, out to the super frontier where nobody has gone before. We've also thought about, and Noah, you're starting to become in charge of business development at my Amazon guy. We're structurally trying to figure out how do we go upstream? How do we get the big clients? How do we get the $15,000 a month clients at MAG? Because we're the king of SMB right now. Man, 12 days to close a contract, super awesome. We do really good. Now to close an enterprise account or a mid-market account, that's going to take like 8 months. What kind of budget do we need for that? What kind of team do we need to build for that? That's uncomfortable to think about too, because then we have to go out and build that. But 2.5 years ago, I didn't have an outbound sales team at all. We were 100% inbound. And so if we look at how we cracked that, it's the same process. Make a theory, go take some action. My spirit animal is a hummingbird. I don't believe in measuring twice and cutting once. I believe in just making a micro improvement every day, but like sometimes 17 micro improvements in the same day, because you got to get the nectar by the end of the day. Like, it doesn't feel good unless you do. So those are the things I'm thinking about doing right now at MAG. And I've had conversations with bankers. I've had conversations with M&A people. I want to throw up in my mouth a little bit every time I do it.
Something you did say, which was kind of interesting, is you can always just add into the acquisition agreement, every employee has to take culture index before papers are signed. Easy as that. And then whether or not it's worth it. Exactly what will happen if you ever do that.
I already know the data is going to be, half good, half not. I already know that.
Ruin every single deal that comes through the door.
It could. I mean, the ones that have their people so right won't want to sell anyway, which has been the next problem. I look at like me and Elias with Trivium. I'm like, I'll buy your company, dude. Like, I talk to him like every other month, like, hey, you want to sell me a piece today? He's like, I don't need you. And I'm like, I know you don't, but it's fun. And he's out like becoming a super YouTuber, doing his thing, and gave him a bunch of advice. I told him how to do thumbnails, and now all of a sudden he's out ranking my own videos. And I'm like, damn it, I should have bought the company, right? Like that's what happens.
The YouTube has always been so interesting to me. So why content? Is there a specific reason when you got everything started, you went content wise rather than just going, into typical agency, which typical agency I would imagine is usually just, hey, let's throw a ton of money at Facebook ads, Google ads, everything. What led you into exactly this, the core 4 of your lead gen?
All right, so Alex or Mosey fans will appreciate this. So here's the 4 quads of lead gen. So that first LinkedIn post was kind of a warm outreach, right? Like, hey, do you know anybody? I hadn't built any content yet. I got a warm intro in the first 48 hours, signed a deal. That's warm intro. Every failed startup I worked at, like the people I worked at that were competent would intro me to their next company, and I would end up getting a side hustle consulting deal, like a crazy amount. My largest referral tree is 23 deep. 23 referrals came out of a single source. One source referred 3 people. Those 3 people, one of them referred another 7. One of those 7 referred another 5. 23 deep, it was crazy. So that's warm outreach. Content, though, is like the most scalable quad, no question. It is the one that is amazingly quick. And by the way, this is a good like entry point to the frustration of most visionaries, right? Like they have these most avid visions. It's like we're a visionary who's taken LSD and we've seen the craziest things. I've never taken LSD. I want to make this abundantly clear. But imagine if you had taken LSD before, just based on what I see in the movies, like people talk about like the weird things that they see, the colors and how they're like connected to the universe and whatever.
Nicolas Cage movie, Lucy. That's the one I always think of. Anytime someone ever talks about it, my mind just goes to that movie.
Something Yellow Submarine. I don't know. But like, I think that visionaries have a very hard time. Just like a drug addict has a hard time explaining what he sees to somebody who's never done LSD before. It'd be like you trying to explain like what salt tastes like, and I've never had salt before. That's what it's like to be a visionary. So I'm a visionary. I had this acid trip over the weekend, and I want to do this one thing in the business. I want to hire 100 interns today. What the frick is the CEO thinking? Like, I don't understand. We got to save the business from him. No, I'm serious. I'm going to go hire 100 interns. And so like, imagine being a visionary trying to express your vision like this and trying to get it out there. That's what I feel like every day. I know there's a lot of visionaries out there who structurally like had a hard time. It'd be like Picasso. Like Picasso, one of the greatest artists of our time. I don't even think he's that old, spectrum on the historical side. Like we're talking last 150 years, I think. Can you imagine being Picasso, doing what you did and then getting no recognition, and then you die, and then all of a sudden you're like one of the top 5 most famous artists of all time? That's what it's like to be a business owner visionary. You see something that nobody else can. So I spend a lot of my time trying to figure out, how do I make this understandable to other people around me? Because I can't just take LSD and inject it into them, business LSD at this point. So that doesn't work. So how do I sound unhinged on this podcast. Like I'm going to get like the comments we're going to get on this, like, what the hell is Steven talking about? Exactly. That's kind of the point, right? Like, that's what it's like to be the visionary, because you have no idea what I'm trying to convey right now, except a couple of people who do. And for those couple of people, they're on the trip with us. That's what it's like to be a visionary in a business world. The Chick-fil-A owner probably went down the Dominican Republic, heard one person say my pleasure to him, and he's like, I want everybody at Chick-fil-A to say my pleasure, right? It took him 10 years, a full decade to get people at Chick-fil-A to say my pleasure. We have at my Amazon guy probably a dozen random documents that are very much like the my pleasure thing. Never apologize. Just say thanks for your patience. But that sort of like culture setting, it's very shaping. Yeah.
Those type documents I always see, and that's the most interesting thing. You talked about the culture. The leader at the top has to implement and be the culture for everyone else below them. All of those documents you do yourself. I've seen it in real time. So it's very easy, I think.
I get frustrated. I'm like, you guys don't get it. You don't see it. Come on. Like, I'm tired of saying this. I put together a couple of bullet points and then I make people like recite it. And then we get onto meetings and I'm like, read this document with me out loud. What does this mean? Do you see what I'm saying here? And then I repeat it over and over again. I'm like the master chief repeater in chief guy. That's what a prophetic visionary has to do, right? You got to get a little cult, you got to get a little following, and they go around and chant your rhyme. And then all of a sudden you make history. You make something special. I'm a caveman with fire. You're a caveman without fire. Let me give you some of my fire. Oh my gosh, this changed your world. You no longer have to eat raw meat. You no longer have to eat hard roots. Wow, when you cook things, it makes it easier and digestible. And all of a sudden you can do more things. And now that you know how to use fire, you can make weapons that aren't just a stick and a rock. You can smelt things together. It makes a massive difference. But can you imagine being the first caveman with fire? Everybody looking at you be like, oh my gosh, that is scary. Get that thing away from me.
I think that goes in line as well with people who you give the fire to people, and especially at least knowing you say, take this fire and run with it. And then people take fire and turn it into metal somehow, right? And that is just something that I see you very often, education, coaching, trying to get people to learn, trying to get people to come up with different ideas, as well as you bring that to the table a lot in MAG, especially. Just, give them one thing and that thing turns into another. Multiply yourself, multiply more.
We've almost hit every core value without saying that on our podcast today. And I know we have to wrap up because, somebody who's listened this long is probably tired of us by now. I mean, we might have to put the word unhinged in the title. What was your main takeaway today, Noah?
Main takeaway at the end of the day is this, that a business, especially one like MAG, whether it's an agency, anything like that, requires level of dedication and a level of just kind of going with it. You say a lot you had to do and make a lot of hard decisions, and you probably should have made some of those sooner. But the core takeaway from that is a business can still stand 6 years and be probably the best it's ever been, even with a couple of mistakes here and there, as long as you are sticking to the core belief that you were trying to do at the end of the day. I think every core thing that you talked about at the very beginning of the podcast, we talk about the stuff that you're wanting to do in the future. All of that still resonates to, I think, the core principles MAG was kind of built on and still is today.
It's an extension of our core. I love it. Well, to everybody listening today, thanks for listening. Add a comment about your most unhinged takeaway. Curious to hear what you have to say. It's probably the LSD comments. I'm sure it will be. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you guys later. Have a good one.